Network attached storage can mean a number of different things. So it could mean a computer that has shared folders and drives that can be accessed over the network, or it could be a dedicated device like this, which was seen in the previous video. And you can also set up a file server that accesses drives which are separate. And this is sometimes described in textbooks as what network attached storage is. But again, to reiterate, network attached storage is really several different things. It has multiple meanings. The only thing it really isn't is a storage area network, which is a specific method for sharing files over a network. And this is something that's complicated enough to have its own dedicated video. I haven't decided if I'm going to do it yet or not. Another exception is a directly connected hard drive. That's not a NAS either. But when you convert a computer to be network attached storage, you have a few different options. I demonstrated Samba, which is software to easily share folders over a network from computers such as Raspberry Pis, so anything cheap or something expensive if you want to. But of course, if your budget is big, you could get a proper network attached storage device. But another option is to run Open Media Vault. And Open Media Vault allows you to completely convert a Raspberry Pi or other computer to a network attached storage device, which will not function as anything else. And strangely enough, even though Raspberry Pis are very, very popular for this purpose, Open Media Vault have withdrawn some of their support for it. It won't run with, an ISO image burned to a boot disk anymore. You have to do a little bit more reconfiguration. And if you go to the downloads page and follow the link for single board computers, they just give you instructions. I'm actually going to follow my own set of instructions, which are much more complete than this. And that will be the subject of this video: how to convert a Raspberry Pi to a network attached storage device. One disclaimer I should put in is that this won't destroy your Raspberry Pi in any sense or force it to be that forever. Basically, you install this software on the SD card that you use for booting it, and then if you want to use the Raspberry Pi for something else, you pull that SD card out and you put a different SD card in with whatever operating system you want to run, such as, Raspbian or Ubuntu. But so long as it's running this particular bootable SD card, it will only run as Open Media Vault. So that's the one thing you have to remember. It won't be usable for any other purpose, for example, word processing or anything, when this particular system is booted on it. Now, here I am in the Raspberry Pi Imager again. And the first step in installing Open Media Vault on a Raspberry Pi is actually not to flash the bootable Open Media Vault software to the SD card, even though you'd expect that to be the case. It used to be the case they would give you a bootable ISO that you could use immediately. One of the drawbacks to how they do it now is that you have to put the Lite version of the Raspberry Pi OS, basically command line only, on an SD card before you install Open Media Vault using the internet, as you will see. So I'm going to choose my OS here. Raspberry Pi Other. There's Full and there's Lite. We'll go with Lite, which by modern standards is not that huge, around 400 megabytes, but I still think that's a bit big compared to Alpine or something like that. But anyway, that's a tangent. So I choose that one. And I choose an SD card. Nothing is listed because I haven't inserted one yet. I insert an SD card. There it is. Now this one is one of the ones I was using for previous experiments, but it doesn't have anything valuable on it. So it's not a problem to wipe this and start it. Right. It will be erased, and that's true. I'm already aware of that. So as before, the writing will take a while. I'll probably jump ahead in the video, although obviously this will be much faster than my other installs that I've demonstrated because we're only installing the command line interface for this. This is the most basic Raspberry Pi OS version, even if, as I said, there are probably some other Linux distributions you can find for running on a Raspberry Pi which are even smaller than this. I'm using this one this time because the current instructions for Open Media Vault specify this OS and not a different one. Obviously, if I hear more, I might do another video on that. But for now, this has to be the way. Okay, so it's been written to the SD card. I will remove the SD card now. And we can continue. Now, one other disclaimer I should add here is that a downside to the approach that Open Media Vault have taken for this latest version of Open Media Vault is that you cannot set up the Raspberry Pi from the network, allegedly anyway, partly because it has to be restarted again and again. So I can't set this up in the way that I set up Samba. I have to use a monitor and keyboard. So I'll set up a rig for that, set up a video camera, and so on, and we will continue from there. So this is my test rig for the Raspberry Pi 3 Model B, of course. Most important distinct feature of it being the full HDMI port, which allows me to connect the monitor without an adapter. So I'll connect that here. And there it goes. Even if I don't actually have any power or signal going through it yet. Then I have the transceiver for the wireless mouse. And there's the keyboard. The keyboard cost me about 20 or 30 bucks if you convert the figures over. It's a very cheap one, and generally they're pretty cheap. So I'm plugging it in there to the USB 2 port. This flash drive will be the storage for the Open Media Vault, same as in the Samba project. Then I have the power supply. This power supply is the same one that I showed in my Raspberry Pi review video, but I have it out of the box here because I'm actually going to use it in this video. It plugs into the USB-B port. It doesn't serve any other purpose other than the power supply on the Raspberry Pi 3 Model B. And I've completely unwrapped the cord there because I have to reach it down to the outlet, which is close to the floor. I have it set up for a check outlet there, you can see, but it could take attachments for any number of different outlets. Then I also need an internet connection for this. So to keep things simple, I have this Category 5 Ethernet cable that I can just connect directly to my router. So here I'm connecting it to the RJ45 port on the Raspberry Pi. I'm not going to plug in the power supply just yet because there's no power switch on a Raspberry Pi, and if I plug this in, it will immediately power on, which I don't want to do yet. I want to move my camera to point to the screen so that we can do a little bit of command line stuff here. So I have the camera rearranged here, and I have the lights out, and I'm about to start putting commands into the command line. So first I'm going to boot up the command line only version of Raspberry Pi OS or Raspbian, Raspberry Pi OS Lite. Even though it has some graphical features to it, it does not have a regular graphical user interface. There's the rainbow screen that you start out with, and it loads a bunch of the components of the Lite version. It's bigger than Alpine, but it's smaller than any other Raspberry Pi OS version. So it still has to load up a bunch of stuff. And we have to wait a little bit here. It's not instantaneous. I apologize for the poor focus. It was very, very hard getting the camera to focus on the screen without zooming in. But you get the idea that Raspberry Pis, as other Unix machines and Linux machines are, they tell you everything they're doing. So here I'm zooming into the command line, and I'm going to put in my credentials here, Pi, and then the default password, which is Raspberry. You definitely should change that for any kind of production application. And then I'm going to install OpenMedia Vault from the command line. And this will be a little bit awkward. I apologize. It's kind of a long command. Many people comment about this. So you start with sudo or sudo, but we have to upgrade the existing operating system first. So we go with sudo apt update. This is the update for the operating system only, if I understand correctly, whereas upgrade is for the other applications. If somebody knows better than this, please let me know, because it would be good to add to the description of this video. My understanding is this is OS only for the update. I'm able to download all these from the internet because of the Ethernet cable that I plugged in earlier. So now that that's done, I have to run the upgrade command. So sudo apt upgrade. As I said, if I understand correctly, this is an upgrade to the bundled software that comes with the Raspberry Pi OS, albeit very minimal software in this case because it's only the Lite version. The switch Y there, the -Y, is to automatically say yes to all of the "do you want to really install this" questions, basically. So you consent to everything. Again, this is not it's not an installation with a lot of fat on it, basically. It's only the very most basic Raspberry Pi OS installation, so you wouldn't need to say no to very much, really. It's only the most basic stuff. So we're back to the command line. Then we have to make sure that our network is set up correctly. I admit that this command is solely from the instructions that I found online for OpenMedia Vault. This wouldn't necessarily apply to all networking applications in Raspberry Pi OS, but it's sudo rm-f for a switch. And this directory path, etc. or etc. system D, and then another / for network. Then / 9999, that is, hyphen, we get this in here, default.link. It's kind of off screen there, but it's default.link. That's what it is. So we run that by just hitting return. Here I'm holding off on a little bit. You don't get any message, and presumably that means in this case no errors. I have no evidence to the contrary. Then you reboot the system by doing sudo or sudo reboot. because you want all of that to take effect. And it runs through the whole reboot process again there, with the rainbow screen, which is now off camera a little bit. And when this finishes, we will do the actual Open Media Vault install itself, which, as you'll see, is awkward because I can't do a screen share. Or screencast in this case. So we log back in, Pi, and the password. And we then have to put in this, once this lets us do it. Still struggling a little bit here. I found that for some of these logins, I had to make more than one attempt because it seems as if this has not been implemented 100% right. If you screw it up, you can see that I'm struggling there. There we go. Another attempt here. Fiddling with the camera here to get us lined up correctly, and it still will not be 100%. But basically, to install Open Media Vault, once the camera gets arranged here correctly, you put in wget, finding my keyboard here, wget hyphen or switch uppercase O. This is not a 0, this is not a lowercase o, that is an uppercase O, space, and another hyphen, and another space, HTTPS for secure HTTP, because we're going to be downloading from the GitHub website. So https:// GitHub, of course. I'm sure everyone knows this website quite well if they do any kind of development. / again. Now, Open Media Vault is one word, although you capitalize the first letter of each word. Unfortunately, it's running off the screen here on us. This was rather hard to coordinate. Again, I would prefer a screencast, but in this case, it wasn't practical the way I was doing it. But this would be followed by -plugin, -developers, also capitalized, and the first letter. So get the camera moved over here. You can see it there, -plugin, -developers, / install, lowercase I, script, same word, with an uppercase S, / raw, RAW, / master, the way it's usually spelled, MASTER, / install, and another space after this. I have to move the camera in a minute here. And a pipeline, this is a vertical line used in programming. It is not the uppercase I, it is not the lowercase l. It is a pipeline. You can look that up. Sudo again, sudo, or sudo, SUDO, is next. Space, bash, because this is a bash and then we will hit return to run this bash. You can see the full extent of the command there. If you need to review it, write it down. So we'll hit return finally, and it'll start to install. This is a bit of a slow install, partly because it's a Raspberry Pi. It takes about 30 minutes by most of the official documentation. In my case, it took a little bit longer because I'm not using the newest Raspberry Pi. Not using the 4, I'm using the 3. So this takes a little while, obviously, and I have greatly clipped the video here. This is nowhere close to how long it actually took. So I'm logging back in there. It's the Raspberry Pi login. But that IP in IP version 4 and IP version 6 is what we need to log in later. You'll see that in a little bit, that you need 192.168.0.102. In this case, your Raspberry Pi installation may vary. I set up my router so that will be the only IP used. IP version 6, well, if you're really advanced, that's what you use. Okay, a few more disclaimers before we get started. First of all, I would like to point out that once you have the Lite version of Raspberry Pi OS on the Raspberry Pi, what you can do to continue from the Windows command prompt or a remote SSH connection from any other computer is to activate it in the Raspberry Pi command line. Now, you can see here that I'm in the Windows command line. I've already set it all up. So this is unnecessary now, but I'm just showing this to you in case you want to switch over to your main computer sooner in the process. So if you go to raspi-config, this is also in a previous video or two that I've done. If you go to raspi-config, sudo raspi-config, and you go to interface options, SSH can be switched on and off right here. So we will just stay with yes here. And of course, it's kind of obvious that the SSH server is enabled because we're already here. So that's one disclaimer. So here is the web interface for Open Media Vault. This is the login screen. You don't actually access Open Media Vault via VNC generally. You can obviously access the Raspberry Pi itself via SSH, as I showed you before. But it is meant to be used via a web interface, much like a home router. So if we put in our basic admin credentials here, your default username is admin, your default password is Open Media Vault. You probably want to change that if you're going to use this for anything because it's too obvious to keep it that way. So I should show you a few basics then. That means the configuration's changed. Probably some stuff I was doing earlier. This required a fair amount of bug fixing, and this is really my second disclaimer of note, that although Open Media Vault has much wider capability than simply Samba, Samba is integrated into Open Media Vault actually for when you're using SMB CIFS protocol. You can see it there on the list. But you do not get the same level of functionality simply from Samba as you do from Open Media Vault. So this is the reason to tolerate its quirkiness. But I've had a fair number of technical issues with it since I started this. It's clearly not as reliable. Really obviously not as reliable. Okay, so the first thing, of course, is that you would want to change your password. So you put in the new password, you confirm the password, and you save. We're not going to do that because I've already done that. I actually was going through this, troubleshooting it for a while because of the quirks. I'll get to those in a minute. I switched the time zone to Prague. Another thing you want to do, definitely, is you want to set your interfaces to use a static IP if possible. Now, I've also set this up on the router, but ideally, you want to use a static IP. You don't want it. Oops, why is this fighting? Oh, there we go. I gotta say static IP. That's the problem. Okay, so 192.168.0.102, as in the earlier install. This is a Class C subnet. You can tell from the numbering scheme. It's a home network, so we use this net mask. In case you don't know that already, Type C will always use this, 255.255.255.0. I'll save it. Apply. Yes. Now the next thing, this is one of the quirkiest things about it. When you go down to the disks here, and you select your disk to use, this will be our flash disk, of course. I found that when I used my existing flash disk, never worked until I erased it and started over. I think that has to do with the privileges, that the privileges somehow didn't transfer over. Ideally, they should not have designed it that way so that it's that quirky, but this was, of course, only an experimental disk, so I simply reformatted it. One tricky thing is that although you can do that from Open Media Vault, you can only use Linux file formats generally. At least all the good ones are Linux. So X4, as on the SDCard here. The problem is that it doesn't work on these flash drives, even though it theoretically should. But for some reason it doesn't. So I used NTFS, and the way I did that was I simply formatted it in Windows. I didn't try to use Open Media Vault to format it. So then you want to mount it, because if you don't mount it, it will not appear when you try to share a folder or anything else on it. So we will mount it. Did that mount? Let's see. Select. Oops. Oh, it did. Okay. Apply. This hesitates a little bit sometimes. Another quirk I've also encountered is when you try to set the static IP, it sometimes doesn't work either. So if you've set it up properly at your router, it's not necessarily anything to worry about. One of the things you can do is use a DHCP reservation to make sure that the DHCP will only give your Raspberry Pi the IP you want it to. Because most people want to keep DHCP switched on, to be honest. Then we go to shared folders. This is the next step. And there is no shared folder on that drive. I actually erased it, as I said. So we'll create a new one. Pi OMV NAS. And I happen to know already that the drive is a different name. You don't want to give the drive and the shared folder the same name, I don't think. I've found that that's a problem. So your permissions here, you can see I'm setting the permissions, everyone read and write for this demonstration. This is the simplest way to do it. Obviously, you can give different access rights to different groups of users. As I said, this is a fairly sophisticated system. We select our device, and as you can see, I have called the disk, if you can call it that, the flash drive, Pi OMV NAS SDR for storage, So we will save that. There's our shared folder. We do still have to apply. They keep making you do this apply stuff. Now over here we have our services. So SMB CIFS, this is basically the implementation of Samba in Open Media Vault. And we still have to create a specific share for it to use. So we go to shares. You can see this tab here. It's easy to miss. So we go to services, SMB CIFS. Once we're in, we go to shares. We put add. We put the shared folder that we just created. Is it public? If you set it as only guests, this sounds like a restriction, but it's not a restriction. Only guest is actually the most open setting you can use for this. So again, we're going to go the easy route in this. In a real-world situation, you'd probably be more restrictive with this. It's obviously not going to be read-only, because I'm trying to build the same type of shared folder as in the Samba demonstration. It's obviously browsable. Access control list, this is the default setting. I'm not going to mess with this, even though I'm not sure if in this situation having access control list is what you want. You want that in a more restrictive setting typically. Permission inheritance, I can't really decide. I generally am able to get away without setting this. As it says, the permissions on new files and directories are normally governed by create mask and directory mask, that the inherent permissions parameter overrides this. This can be particularly useful on systems with many users to allow a single share to be used flexibly by each user. I suppose we can experiment with that. It is in line with what we're trying to do, but it's not a necessity, I don't believe. Now we also want to store DOS attributes because we'll be using DOS files. Save. We have to apply again. Say yes again. So then the final step, we go back to services, SMB CIFS. Actually, we don't have to do that. We can do this. We can just click the settings tab, and then we switch it on because it's not enabled by default. Another option is you can allow the server to advertise it as itself as a time server. But we don't need that because we have a time server through our ISP, actually, through the router. And we already have it set browsable, asynchronous I/O support. We can have the send file system. Don't have to have that on, but I have it on anyway. So we save again, enable again, or apply again, excuse me. Enable, save, apply. That's actually the workflow. Now, theoretically, this should work now. That is, theoretically, because it took me more than one try to get this to work, doing the whole thing over at least once. So, although this clearly is a very capable program compared to simply Samba, it, as I said earlier, is clearly also not as reliable or as consistent. But we'll see how we do. We'll go back to Windows now. Actually, one other thing I should point out, you can restart your Raspberry Pi from this menu over here. There's one little thing I should add, but in this case, we're only going to log out, actually. This has nothing to do with the hardware. This is just logging out of the account in the web browser. And we are out. So now I'll go back to Windows. So here I am in this PC, just like in the Samba demonstration. And you can see some of my failed projects here, struggling with this, but should work now. There's the network. And there's a Raspberry Pi. And there's our shared folder. So if we go to this PC, right-click, Map Network Drive. This is just like Samba. And we browse. There's our shared folder. Open. Finish. And there it is. Now, it is empty. That's because I deleted the disk. Let's do our first operation here and upload some files. Now this time, I will paste in 3 demonstration files. There they go. I have sharing test 1 and sharing test 2, and I have the reservoir photo from earlier. And of course, if I want to download one of these, say we download sharing test, all I have to do is drag and drop to the desktop. See, and then it asks me if I want to replace the file, because I've effectively copied it. But we'll skip it. One downside to Open Media Vault is that it is not the same as simply transferring from one PC to another PC. The Raspberry Pi only functions as network-attached storage, so to take full advantage of this, you really would need to have yet another PC on the network that could connect to this to demonstrate it properly. But I suppose the best way to demonstrate this, really, that this worked, is if I disconnect the network drive, we go to this PC, disconnect network drive, we select it and we click OK. They're warning us about open files, but there are no open files. Actually, I should, yeah. Okay, so yes, and it's disconnected. Now what I can do, but really this is the best way I can prove that I have the files moved over. I've shut down the Raspberry Pi, pulled the flash drive out, and plugged it into my PC, and this is what's in it. All the same files I moved over before. But you can see there are pros and cons to Open Media Vault. It's worth showing. I'm certainly pleased with what you get for the money, which is no money at all. Actually, it's a free program, so you can't complain too much, of course. And it has, as you probably noticed in the menus, FTP support and all kinds of other cool things that I may demonstrate in future videos. But in any case, that's the Open Media Vault software and how you use it. You convert your Raspberry Pi completely into network-attached storage as opposed to simply a Raspberry Pi with shared folders, as with Samba. So in any case, thanks for watching.